So speaking of children, we've heard these horrific stories of, a child being sick or in some way in need of medical care, and fundamentalist parents laying hands on the child or praying for the child and neglecting the medical treatment. And a lot of times, at least in the States, what happens is the government will say there's nothing we can do at the time because, that's your religious freedom. But once the child dies, then they can say, okay, well, you neglected them from medical treatment or something else. They won't kick in the door and take the child for medical care, even if it's a preventable or curable disease or sickness. But they will, after the fact, say, okay, well, you neglected to provide that child with medical treatment. And so obviously there's this blurred line between religious freedoms and protecting someone from religious hurt and harm. So we all probably have different lines. I want to start with you, Sarah. Where do you draw that line between people having the freedom to express their own religion and practice their own religion, and then preventing a child from being harmed? Even something small like, for example, Amish will often take their children out of school at like second grade and say, that's enough learning for you, get on the farm and start working. There's different levels of harm. Where do you draw that line?
Well, it's easy to make the distinction in some cases. Like if you were to look at the female genital mutilation cases that are coming out of Michigan, and they're finding that there have been girls, 100 girls or so, that have been cut in Michigan, in the United States, and they're going through and they're trying to prosecute the doctors who performed the operations. And I think in those cases it's an easy call to make. It's easy to say that, well, this is a child, is a human being, and they have the right to their bodily integrity. And very clearly, their bodily integrity has been harmed or even destroyed in some cases, depending on how bad the actual cut was. So I think it's easy to make the case in something like that. It's harder when you look at something like the hijab, which I find to be quite harmful. I find it to be something that really just instills this sense of shame in a young woman about her body and about her sexuality. So it's very easy for me to argue that this is harmful too. But I'm uncomfortable with saying that parents should not be allowed to request or even push their children to wearing a hijab.
Let me ask you there about the hijab. Aren't there some women who find sort of a sense of pride in wearing it, so that if you were to try to say, I find that harmful, I'm going to fight for you not to have to wear this, would you get some pushback from women within Islam that'll say, excuse me, I find this as a rite of passage, or this is a symbol of my connection to God, or something along those lines, where they don't want to be protected from that and they find it offensive that you find the hijab offensive?
Well, I mean, anytime you talk about banning anything, you run the risk of turning it into from a religious symbol to a political symbol, and then it becomes almost more powerful. In a lot of ways, it does become more powerful because people who might not be religious to begin with might wear the hijab out of solidarity because they feel like this is that their Muslim brothers and sisters or their civil liberties are being infringed upon. So they will do it out of this sense of solidarity, and that's terrible because what it does is it covers up the actual harm that's taking place and the religious justification, which we need to talk about and we need to discuss and we need to understand why it's so harmful and why.
Do you think it's abusive for a parent to have their child wear a hijab? Is it?
It's interesting because I can definitely say it's harmful, but whether abuse is different because to some extent it has this connotation where the parent is trying to harm the child in some way. And I don't know if that's the case. And in fact, many Muslim parents, they think that they're protecting their girls. They think they're doing what's best for them. They think they're going to set them up for life once they've, taught them the values of modesty. So is it abuse from that perspective? I don't know, but it definitely does have a harm.
Well, it's also confused by the fact that in many cases they're right about how their daughters will be treated in the community by Muslim boys and men if they don't wear the hijab. So they are protecting them from abuse in in that
in that
particular
context.
context.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. That it's a rational decision to protect your child, not just from the hereafter and what God is going to do there, but the way that they're going to be treated in this life here and now. So from that perspective, you can even look at many Muslim homes. A lot of ex-Muslims that I talk to, women especially, the ones that were forced into hijab, and they'll talk about how it was their mothers who forced them to wear the hijab, who enforced these sort of codes on them, these modesty codes on them, who made them feel ashamed about their sexual urges. But if you look at it from the perspective of the mother is trying to protect somebody who she cares about very much, and she wants to make sure that her daughter has every option open to her, within that society. So it's a tricky thing.
Yeah, I've heard a similar argument. Of course, that's much less harmful, but I've heard a similar argument from fundamentalist parents who would want to lay hands on a child who is sick. When you challenge them with why not give them medication and pray, why not do both, they would actually say that's an affront to God's power. That's a slap in the face to God. How dare you think he's going to be limited or somehow not going to perform this miracle? And they would do the same way. We're doing it so that God knows how much we love him. And at that point, obviously, we would say that's where the line is. There's a clear line there.
It's always strange that they never do that with amputations. I mean, this is the website, you probably still exists. Why does God hate amputees? No one has ever successfully prayed for the regrowth of an arm or a leg, and everyone prays for or is tempted to pray for conditions that on their face seem liable to be self-limiting, whereas something like a lost limb clearly isn't. But if God had that power, you would be tempted to pray even there.
Yeah. The interesting thing is we run the risk of, I guess, advocating for legislation that would then go into people's homes and tell them how to raise their children, which most secular people are like, hey, let people do what they want to do in their homes, and but when you start bringing these types of topics up, I would advocate that should be illegal, and that you shouldn't be able to do that. Well, now am I
religion? If you take the sanctity of religion out of it, and you just talk about it in terms of belief, right? And then you think of I mean, it's clear. I mean, the state clearly has an interest, and we all have an interest in not letting our neighbors destroy their children. Because obviously we shouldn't let our neighbors kill their children, and we shouldn't let our neighbors so harm their children that they become adults that we find it very difficult to live with. So there's some area there where the state and we all have an interest in intruding into the lives of parents who are parenting badly, and it doesn't matter if their motives are religious, right? So like the crucial taboo to get past, especially in the States, is this idea that, well, if it was a religious motivation for not giving medicine, or not, these extreme cases where
like blood transfusion.
The kid is found out to be diabetic, right, and they won't give insulin, right, and the kid dies. That's just straight up child abuse, right? So the fact that there was religion in the mix shouldn't confuse anybody, and it still reliably confuses our courts, and that's the problem.
Well, when it comes to Islam, I think the fact that religion is part of the mix confuses things in another way, in that people don't feel comfortable about bringing it up. They don't feel comfortable saying that FGM or honor violence is more common within Islam and people who practice Islam than it is anywhere else, and so that creates this just impossible challenge for people who are trying to address these harms and see what they can do what preventative action they can take. So say you can maybe train teachers and counselors or what have you to recognize signs of somebody who might be at risk for a forced marriage, for example. But in order to do that, you have to recognize that certain people are more at risk than others, and those certain people come from certain kinds of ethnic backgrounds or certain kinds of religious backgrounds. And those are things that people are very uncomfortable doing. They're uncomfortable with even touching that issue and talking about it and saying that this particular harm may be unique to this community, particularly if that community is a minority of any kind, especially with Islam. So that adds another layer of challenges to this.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to being unable to effectively define harm. Because you could say, oh, anything that harms a child, your belief shouldn't be that important. But then again, and as we're advocating for some sort of legislation to keep children safe from religious harm, we can use that word. They can say, look, what we're doing is actually protecting our child from hell or from whatever. And so they could advocate that they're, it's like, you get a shot at the dentist. It hurts a little bit now, but it's good for the overall. They make that argument that it's bad for the child now, but it'll be better when they're gone or when they're in heaven. And so then you get to this sort of fight of we're doing what's best for the children. No, we're doing what's best for the children. And then we have to advocate for legislation that would then go into someone's home and say, if your child is sick, you must do something with the doctor. Otherwise, it's neglect and abuse. It'd be kind of a scary situation, I think. I don't want us to come off as hypocrites by saying, let's advocate for this legislation that's going to tell you how to raise your children, when that's what we've been against this whole time is let me raise my kids the way I want. Don't force me to take my kid to a school that's going to teach them about religion.
Well, the school is also an important part of it. If the schools were sufficiently intrusive in what they taught, then you can outsource a lot of that to the state in that sense. I mean, if for instance, evolution, if the schools just taught evolution and there was no scope for religious parents on the school board to say, well, no, actually we should be teaching the controversy, then the kids, despite what the parents believe about the Bible and God and the origin of humanity, the schools would be teaching evolution and the religious parents would just have to deal with it, right? So I think that the state could intrude without ever having to kick in the door and change what's happening in the home. It could, and the same with the hijab. If schools wouldn't let you wear a hijab, then it wouldn't be on the parents or on anyone else to make that decision. There would just be, there's no hijab in schools, so
that seems like not a good idea.
Why?
Well, in the case of Muslim girls, you're talking about a population who, well, first of all, what would be the parents' reaction to hearing that their child, when they have to go to school, they have to take off the hijab? For some, it might be, okay, we'll have them take off the hijab. For others, it's we're putting you into a religious school where this is going to be allowed. Or we're taking you back home where, you don't have to worry about that at all and you can be covered. So this idea that we will necessarily protect the most vulnerable Muslim women, I don't think that's necessarily the case. There have been similar conversations about banning the hijab in certain kinds of public official jobs, where you're working in a government office, for example, that there shouldn't be a display of religious affiliation in that sort of a visible way. Usually these conversations happen with Europeans, French in particular, but I think that can be harmful as well, because then you're taking away just that another employment opportunity from a woman who might need it, for whom this might be another tool for her to be a little bit more empowered than she would be otherwise. I can't see how that would ultimately help the women that we want to do something for.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that the French approach is too heavy-handed. I mean, I think the banning the burqa is, in certain contexts, I think you would need to ban it, but in general, I think I worry about the same thing, of just isolating the most vulnerable people in the Muslim community, because there's, if their parents won't let them see doctors, they won't let them go to school, and you don't know you don't have enough information to actually know what's happening behind closed doors. So